Hello there, welcome back and welcome to another review video. Today I am reviewing the RMS Titanic engine room set at 1:700 scale. So this is the smallest set that is currently offered and it is mighty tiny, but the detail is still pretty impressive. So we're going to go into this and because I've built the 1:400 scale set, what I will do is I will give my thoughts on this sort of in contrast to the 1:400. That sort of gives us a good idea of what you sort of lose at a lower scale, what you gain at a higher scale, but also what may be a bit more sort of accessible at this scale as well. So, without any further ado, let's crack on. Okay, so let's start off by opening up the box. So, as you can see inside, we've got some foam, some instructions, a bit more foam, and then the actual model itself. So here is the stern. We've actually got the bow as well. Oh, I see. And then we've got boiler rooms and all of the rest of the equipment that needs to be cut out and assembled. Now, just a word on packaging. This packaging leaves a bit to be desired, to be honest. It's very space efficient, and I think it looks quite nice. You know, there's nice artwork on the box and so on. But I could see things getting damaged here quite easily. A few people have reviewed this set, and there's been fairly sort of unanimous feedback that the sort of layout of the packaging does need to improve, and that is something that Tori Factory have taken away and will work on. So if you were to buy this set, your packaging would be quite significantly improved. So although this isn't great, don't be alarmed about that, because fixes are already in the works for that. So let's just lose this packaging now, and let's have a wee shifty at the instructions. So at this scale, there is no photo etch, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, I struggled with photo etch on the 1:400 scale. So I think photo etch at this scale would be just an impossibility, really. So step one is to get your boiler rooms and your boilers fitted into place. So that's this section here. This is the boiler room section with boiler room number 1 all the way along to boiler room number 6. And this will be a case of fitting our boilers in place like so. Then we carry on to step 2. So we'll set the boilers aside and we'll take the stern section and we need to fit the engines and the turbines into these compartments here. And then the final step is to fit the propeller shafts onto the end of the propeller runs through the bearing holes, such as that. Then I think it's up to you what you want to do, but my suggestion would be that you combine all these things together to make the whole length of the model. Bada bing, bada boom, happy days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some close-up photos of these parts, because I think that's better than me sort of wafting my hands around while I'm showing you things. And then I'll go into a bit of depth on what I actually think about this model. So let's start off with the boilers. Each one of these boilers is about 10 millimeters long, so look that up on a ruler and you'll appreciate really just how small this scale is. And you still get things like rivet detail. You can still see the plates sort of overlapping each other. There are still things like the safety valves and the regulator valves and that sort of thing all in place on the model. The ends of the boilers are modelled as they were on the 1:400 scale, with a couple of dampers open and one closed, and there is still sort of front end detail, things like gauge glasses, doors, dampers, that sort of thing as well. So the detail is all as it was on the 1:400 scale. What I would say is that just by the nature of this being so much smaller, it's not so much that you lose detail, but just you're sort of fronting up against the limits of the 3D printing. So you can see that the 3D printing lines start to sort of become a little bit more visible at this scale and start to just sort of cut into the detail, as you might expect. With a layer of paint on the top, I think that will sort of subdue down quite nicely, but nonetheless it is just something to bear in mind. Another thing to raise, and again this is just a limitation of the 3D printing technology, but you can see the interconnecting pipework on the top of the boilers. You can see that there is an element of support material in place there which just can't be removed, and again this isn't really... There's nothing that can really be done about this, it's just the limits of the technology at this scale. But again, just something to be aware that this is a difference between the 1:700 and the 1:400 scale. And of course, I think with anything at this scale, you are going to have a very hard job actually picking out detail and getting stuff painted in a really sort of accurate and concise way. I think it would be very challenging, for example, to sort of pick out the detail of gauge glasses, or to even sort of paint the safety valves. I think it's not an insurmountable challenge, but I think it would be a lot harder than it would be at the 1:400 scale or the 1:200 scale. Moving on to the boiler rooms now, and once again they are very nicely detailed and the detail is picked out very well. You can still see things like watertight doors, you can see the bunker doors, all that kind of thing. There are some quite clear printing lines, and they sort of add a kind of texture to the floor, which in fairness I don't actually mind, because it does just sort of show some sort of detail, and it sort of attracts the eye and so on. Again, I think the challenge here will be painting this effectively. One of the big advantages of the 1:400 scale is that all of these parts come separately, so you can paint them before gluing them in. And with this, of course, you don't have a chance. These are already connected to the floor, so you've got to paint them in situ. And if you want to do a job like Titanic Honor and Glory show, where the walls had a sort of black stripe up to about waist level, and then they were sort of painted buff above that, it's probably manageable, but it will be a real challenge of masking and painting, and then probably fine lining with a paintbrush to touch up afterwards. So not an insurmountable challenge, but I think this will be tricky, and it's just something to bear in mind that I think at this scale the painting will be quite significantly harder. However, that said, the detail is still really good. I mean, if you look at this bulkhead wall, you've still got that really nice sort of cable working, pipe work detail. So the detail is still remarkably impressive, even at this really tiny scale. Okay, reciprocating engines. The engines are actually remarkably good at this scale. I was quite surprised. I thought that by this scale you would have to sort of lose things like reverse linkages and stuff because it would just be too small to print, but actually that detail remains and looks extremely good. So I think the engines are probably the highlight of the model in this scale. There is an issue with the engines which I will go into in a bit more depth in just a second, but just to call out a few points. The end shot of the engine here, you can see the shaft which goes down to drive the crank, which looks extremely good. You retain the rivet detail and also the sort of the joint detail between pipework, things like that. As I say, there's no photo etch at this scale, which I think is a good thing, because I do just think that this is too small for it, and I think it would look too thick. I think even very fine brass would look too thick at this scale. So I think it's a good call not to include photo etch. But I mean, I think the engines overall have been really nicely modelled. There's a couple of things that I think are just slightly out of scale. The sort of baffles on the top of the low pressure cylinders are, I think, a little bit too large. And of course, as with my comment on the rest of the model, painting this is going to be a big challenge because, again, on this scale, the engines are just one block. They don't come as separate pieces that you glue together. They're one block. So you either need to mask and paint very, very accurately, or you need to have a very steady hand, or both. Again, nothing insurmountable about that, but it just adds another layer of challenge, and that's a good thing for some people and a bad thing for others. But I do think I was extremely surprised how much detail Tori Factory were able to fit into engines this scale. I mean, these are only about 25 millimeters long. They are extremely small parts, so the level of detail they've got is really genuinely quite impressive. Right, I just wanted to raise a point about the engines. On this model, there is an error with Titanic's main reciprocating engines. Now, this was flagged to me by a couple of people, two of them when they viewed the YouTube channel, and also one looking at the Instagram page where I posted a few photos of this model. And initially, I just sort of thought, yeah, I don't think they're right, actually. And then I got one message through and I thought, yeah, okay, fine. And then I got another and I thought, okay, this is starting to sound a little bit like actually I'm the one that's wrong here. So I went back and checked, and sure enough, there is an error with these engines. I had actually followed the instructions correctly. So the error is with the kit. So to give you an explanation of what this is, this way is towards the bow of the ship. You've got the boiler rooms. This way is towards the stern, where you've got the propellers at the back. Now, Titanic's engines each had 4 cylinders. You had a high pressure cylinder, an intermediate pressure cylinder, and then 2 low pressure cylinders at either end. These are called triple expansion engines. So the steam from the boilers comes in and it goes into the high pressure cylinder, and the steam has some energy extracted, turns the crankshaft, Bob's your uncle. The exhaust steam from the high pressure cylinder then goes into the intermediate pressure cylinder, and the same process happens again. After the intermediate pressure cylinder, the steam is exhausted and it goes into both of the low pressure cylinders. So you extract energy from the steam 3 times in these engines, and each time that happens, the steam expands slightly, and that's why each cylinder gets progressively larger. So high pressure cylinder is the smallest, intermediate slightly bigger, low pressure slightly bigger again. So these were very, very efficient engines. Anyway, that's not really important. The issue is to do with the orientation of these cylinders. On Titanic, the orientation of the cylinders from bow to stern was low pressure cylinder, high pressure cylinder, intermediate, low. So you can see on the model, the high pressure and the intermediate pressure cylinders are the wrong way round. Now, there isn't anything that you can do to fix this. The kit is just sort of has these printed out, mirrored from each other. So there isn't any sort of jiggery pokery that you can do, or at least that I'm aware of, that you can do to make this better. So what's happened is me and a couple of other people who've reviewed this model have got in touch with Tori Factory, and we've sort of let them know that this is a problem. So obviously I guess it's not great that this has happened in the first place, but what I will say, and what I think is really, really positive, is that having raised this as a problem, Tori Factory have immediately put their hands up and gone, yeah, okay, yeah, this is a problem, we'll fix it. And I think, obviously, in an ideal world, you don't want there to be any issues to begin with, but this is a complicated model, crikey. I mean, it's a complex model. And I think it speaks volumes about the company that they've immediately owned up to it and said, yeah, we'll sort that out. So yes, if you've already had a model sent to you, I imagine this fault will exist on it. But in the future, this error is going to be corrected and the orientation of the cylinders will be corrected to be accurate to the real ship. So I just thought I'd put that in because I wanted to raise it as an issue, but I did also want to make very clear that people are aware that Tori Factory were very willing to own up to their mistake and put it right, which I think is a huge positive. Okay, back on with the show. This is the hall where the engines will sit, and as you can see, most of the detail is pre-existing in place. So we've got the winches, the pumps, the reversing engines, all that kind of stuff up the wings of the compartment. And again, the detail here is extremely good. Things like the pipework for the pumps has no support material attached, which is extremely impressive. And those engines at the bottom right of the compartment, again, are extremely well printed with very, very high detail. The compartment wall has a fantastic level of detail on it, with the penetrations going through to the turbine hall beyond. So this is extremely good detail once again. I'm sounding like a broken record, but there you go. But again, as I would point out, painting is going to be a challenge again here, because all of this stuff is already stuck down onto the base. So a steady hand or some very, very, very impressive masking will be required here. So here we have the turbine, and once again the detail is extremely good. We've got the ribbing on the actual turbine casting itself, and all of the rivet seams on the condensers and the other manifolds and stuff that make up this piece of equipment. The pipe work is extremely well done once again, and there's not a huge amount of support material, so extracting this part will be fairly straightforward. So overall, very impressive. There's actually not a huge amount of detail sacrifice between this model and the 1-400, which, considering it's almost twice as small, is frankly quite remarkable. And now we move into the final compartments. We've got the thrust block compartment here, which will also house the turbine. And once again, I mean, the detail on the thrust blocks is phenomenally high. And the same with all the detail on the condenser traps and so on. Particularly things like the small steam engines where the pipe work is completely unsupported, which is, in 1-700 scale, is remarkable. Also, things like the sort of the I-beams and stuff that make up the strength of the bulkhead, again, very, very faithfully and well recreated. I think that's incredibly impressive. Moving into the generator rooms, I mean, crikey, the detail on the generators is just exceptional. You can sort of see into the windings of the generators, which at 1-700 scale is just remarkable. As I say, I think the limitation here on the detail is just the limitations of the 3D printing. The obvious thing here is the support material that hangs under the propeller shafts. You can see that, unlike on the 1-400, these are supported, so you have a sort of like a very thin wall underneath the propeller shaft, which, if you were brave, you could probably try to drill and file out. If you were perhaps a bit less brave, you might just leave it in. But that's the obvious sacrifice you make at this scale. And it does, it does clearly make the model slightly less believable. But we are talking about very, very fine detail here. And also, we are talking about bits of 3D print that would be exceptionally vulnerable to damage were these things not in place. As before, I think your big challenge here, particularly in things like the generator room, is going to be painting. The way I would approach it is probably to do an undercoat in black, because as you can see, the 3D print is quite thin, and you get light bleed through it. So I'd start off with a coat of black primer, and then paint everything white, and then I would start to pick out the detail, so generators into green, the propeller shaft in a sort of metallic grey, maybe something like that. But that is the real challenge at this level, is the painting and the detail that's required to get that accurate. But in terms of the actual recreation, the 3D printing is very, very good. And the last little things to point out are the propellers. As you can see, in this scale, the propellers are actually 3D printed with their shafts already in place. Now, I personally prefer that, because it means that you get absolute perpendicularity between the shaft and the propellers, which is exactly what you want. And that's very, very hard to do when you're gluing them in place. So that sort of solves a very tricky little modelling challenge, purely by it being printed thus. So that's really helpful, and that's actually a big tick for me. And the detail on the shafts is great. I wouldn't say the detail is any less good, really, than the detail at 1-400. Just to note that the central propeller is 3-bladed, so for those of you who believe Titanic had a 4-bladed central propeller, the model comes with only a 3-bladed option. Personally, I think Titanic did have a 3-bladed central propeller, so that's not really a critique for me. But if it's something that you disagree with, that's something to take note of. Now, the last section to talk about is this bow section, and curiously enough, this bow section has a little bit of detail on it. It has the fireman's passage and a couple of sort of walls which kind of represent where bulkheads would have been. Now, the reason I say this is curious is because this detail isn't included on the 1:400 scale model. So in this particular area of the model, there actually seems to be a little bit more detail at 1:700 scale than there is at 1:400 scale, which is a wee bit curious. But I mean, I actually prefer this. I would have preferred that the 1:400 scale had a little bit more detail in this area, so I think that's a good thing. And here we have a photo of the model in all its glory, with the three sections that make up the tank top deck, and then the additional parts that need to be glued in place: boilers, engines, turbine, and the propeller shafts. Just a word on warping. As you can see, this is slightly warped, well, in fact it's very warped. This is a very common occurrence with resin 3D prints. It's kind of unavoidable, it's just part of the manufacturing process, it happens. It's not really the manufacturer's fault, and also it's not an insurmountable problem. A little bit of heat on here, even something like a hairdryer, and then some applied force will flatten this back out. To be honest, I would also suggest, because these are such thin parts, a relatively decent bond of glue onto your baseboard would probably fix this as well. But don't be alarmed by this. It is not a sort of catastrophic problem. Okay, so what do I actually think about this model? So this is the 1:400 here, the one that I built in a previous episode, and this is the 1:700 model here. And I just want to start off by giving a really concise idea of just how small these things are. So I've got a few things that you might have around your house to give you an example. So a tin of beans, in comparison to the 1:700, that is a tin of beans. So that's a nice comparison. Also got a coffee mug, a deck of cards, and finally a good old-fashioned hand. And there you go. So this is small. That's the point I'm trying to make here. This is really, really small. So when you consider just how small this really is, and the reason I've done this, by the way, is because I always feel like when I show the pictures, because they're quite high resolution images, and because the detail is actually remarkably good on this, it's very easy to go away thinking, it's quite a lot bigger than it actually is. Don't be fooled. This is a small, small model. So with all that in mind, the detail on this is really, really impressive. For the size of this model, I was expecting the detail to be far, far less impressive. I was expecting there to be loads of concessions, lots of things missed out because it's just too small to get the detail in. But the reality is that's not the case. I would say, to be honest, the detail at this scale is not that much worse than the detail at 1:400 scale. There's a few things here and there where the detail slightly suffers. As I've already pointed out, we've got things like the support material underneath the propeller shafts, and we've got things like the support material on the boiler pipe work and stuff, things that you just have to do, otherwise you wouldn't be able to print it out in the first place. But beyond that, the detail is pretty comparable from this level up to the next size up, which, as I say, is really, really remarkable. I think the major issue with this size of model is the painting. I just think I found painting this model quite a challenge, particularly things like the reversing linkages on the engine and stuff like that. That was a real challenge. That was sort of threading the paintbrush through with a very small quantity of paint on it and doing a tiny little bit and then taking the paintbrush out, getting a bit more paint, threading it through again. It was really challenging. And that was on a scale which is almost double the scale of 1:700. So, as I've said repeatedly throughout this review, I think painting at 1:700 scale will be a huge challenge. The way I would approach this, as I say, because you can see that there's quite a lot of light bleed because things are thin, I would start off with a black primer, and that should hopefully solve all of the light bleed issues with one fell swoop. And then I'd probably go over in this section with a white. In this section, I would go straight on to the sort of buff colour. But you will need a steady hand to get a good result at this scale. In terms of other things, I think this isn't really a criticism, but I think on both the 1 to 400 and the 1 to 700 scales, there's not a lot more you can do than just build the model. I think at the larger scale, there is a 1 to 200 scale model of this kit as well, which I am yet to review. But I think at that scale, you can add people, and you could add, you know, lumps of coal lying around the boiler rooms. You could even, if you wanted, add LEDs inside the boilers to make it look like there's a furnace blazing away in there. At these two scales, I just don't think that's really an option because I just think they are too small. You can do a bit of weathering, and I have done a bit of weathering here and there. But really, I think that's kind of all the sort of artistic license you get. I don't think there's much more you can do because these things are just too small. I mean, imagine trying to put human beings in this scale, or even 1 to 400. At 1 to 400 scale, I think a human would probably be about 3 millimeters. And it's just too small. You know, there's just no way you'll be able to recreate that detail accurately. That said, I think what they have done with 1 to 700 is they've struck a really nice balance between getting stuff accurate, but also not overreaching themselves. One of the things I sort of thought on the 1 to 400 scale is that the photo etch, although it does add some value, my word, it is fiddly. And I'm very glad that they haven't even given you the temptation at 1 to 700 scale, because I just don't think it would add value. I think it would look out of place. It would look too big, and it just wouldn't quite fit with the scale of the model. So what I actually think about this, I think, if I'm honest, I think this is probably too small a scale. I think there is so much going on that I think this is just slightly too small a scale to faithfully recreate something. I think the 1 to 400 is a nice mix between being small enough and sort of compact enough, whilst still really bringing out some of the beauty of the engineering in here. You know, the engines are small enough that they're not taking up huge amounts of space in your home when the model's built, but they still have a good level of detail. I think at 1 to 700, I just think we're getting to the point where it's just a little bit too small, and I think a lot of the sort of like the really ultra high level interesting stuff is just kind of lost a bit, and it as I say, it is just because it's so small. The advantage of that is obvious. It doesn't take as much room in your house. It's significantly cheaper. If you're wanting to buy a case to put it in, that will obviously be cheaper as well. It doesn't take up too much space on your windowsill, but I do think we're at the point where this is just a little bit too small. I think in some ways you would be better off, or I think my preference perhaps would be, instead of having a 1 to 400 scale model of the whole setup of Titanic's engineering spaces, I think my preference would be to have a model that fits into this size of just the engines, or maybe just the engines and the turbines, so that you can get that real wealth of detail in a small model. But nonetheless, you have a bit more sort of stuff to look at, a bit more interest to gain from it. But that's personal preference. As I say, I don't think there is a lack of detail here, and I think really, in comparison to the 1 to 400 scale, you don't make many sacrifices on detail at this level, but there are some things that perhaps do just slightly suffer. Obviously, the 3D printing lines on 1 to 700 are just a little bit less, are a little bit more obvious, and of course that does mean that they start to sort of encroach into the level of detail. the thing that I've come back to repeatedly is painting, and I'm a decent modeler. I would not be able to paint this as well as I painted the 1:400 scale model. That's a fact. I just wouldn't be able to do it. It's just too small. Getting things like masking tape into these bulkheads and stuff like that, I think would be incredibly hard, time consuming, and I still don't think, even if I spent hours and hours and hours, I still don't think it would look as good as the 1:400 scale. I think ultimately, you know, a model of this quantity of detail with this much stuff going on really has to be big enough to take advantage of that. That said, the sort of application I could see this for, like, I don't know, if you wanted to sort of explain to somebody how a ship of this era worked, you could do it in this scale. You could show, you know, the boilers generate steam for the engines, that's recycled into the turbines, that goes through the thrust blocks and out into the back. Steam's also used to make the electricity in these generators here. Water pressure throughout the ship, heating throughout the ship is supplied through the pumping systems. And here, you know, you could show how a ship actually does what it needs to do. But you wouldn't be able to make a sort of beautiful, unique, nuanced model. So that's my take on this. That said, I do think it's really impressive, and I mean, we live in an age where 3D printing is just so powerful now. The fact that this is even producible is utterly remarkable. So I'll leave you now with some photographs of this in high resolution. Obviously, I'm not going to build this model. I've built the 1:400, and that's the only one of these that I'm going to build. But those are my thoughts. It's very impressive, but for me, I think it's just a little bit too small. The other things that I do just want to sort of like hammer home, this fault with the engines that I've gone into detail on already, yes, it's a problem, but I do think it's really impressive that Tori Factory have immediately said, yeah, we'll resolve that. I think, you know, that's what you want to hear. We're all going to make mistakes, but the fact that they are willing to sort of hold their hands up and go, yeah, we'll rectify that, that is spot on. That's exactly what we want to hear. So just some final information. This model retails for $40. That's US dollars, and I will pop a link in the description to where you can purchase this should you wish. That is certainly the most cost-effective of the engine room models. And another thing just to say, because we have a few questions on this, these are not designed to fit into other models of Titanic or Olympic or Britannic. These are meant to be standalone models. With a bit of jiggery pokery, you might be able to get them to fit in, but that is not the intention of the design. They're meant to be standalone models. So, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, do please like and or subscribe. If you've got any questions, comments, what have you, please do put them down below and I'll try my best to get back to you. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye for now.